The first thing Sergeant Dario Vasquez said to her was, "You lost, sweetheart?" She didn't blink, didn't flinch, I guess just looked at him the way you look at a pothole you've already decided to step over, and said, "FOB Karif. I mean, 3rd Ranger Battalion Attachment. Plus, Captain Reyes Morales." He laughed, the kind of laugh men deploy when they want to shrink someone. "They sent us a nurse. Her name was Captain Reyes Morales. Intel and tactical analysis. 12 years in. 2 deployments in the Horn of Africa before any of us had finished our first. But Vasquez didn't know that yet, and even if he had, I think he would have laughed anyway. That was Vasquez. He needed someone beneath him the way a drowning man needs something to stand on. I was Corporal Jaden Okafor, 24 years old. 3rd deployment. And I think I had the bunk 3 feet from where she dropped her rucksack without asking for help. FOB Karif sat in the Helmand province like something God had abandoned mid-sketch. A cluster of sandbag walls, corrugated steel, and diesel generators humming the same off-key note around the clock. The desert started 20 meters past the wire and went on forever in every direction, brown and merciless and completely uninterested in us. It was April, hot for what it's worth, enough by noon to make your boots feel like they were cooking from the inside out, cold enough at night to make your fingers stupid. We had been there 6 weeks. I guess we were bored, which in a combat zone is the most dangerous thing you can be. The morning Captain Morales arrived, our platoon was doing what soldiers do in the in-between, cleaning weapons we'd already cleaned, trading. The same 5 insults, drinking coffee from packets that tasted like someone had described coffee to a person who never had coffee. Vasquez was holding court near the comm tent, legs stretched out on a sandbag, telling a story about Kandahar that got bigger every time he told it. I saw her come through the gate. She wasn't what the gate usually let in. She walked without the new deployment stiffness, that barely contained alertness that makes fresh arrivals look like cats hearing a strange noise. She walked like someone doing math. Her eyes moved in a grid pattern. Entrance. Which perimeter post? Comm tent. Generator. She was cataloging before she'd said a word to anyone. I remember thinking, she's already seen something she doesn't like. Vasquez clocked her 30 seconds after I did. Aye, he said, with that particular tone, the one that to send a compliment. It's a declaration of territory. What unit? She told him. He asked her kind of what intel and tactical analysis meant out here, since out here was men doing men's work. And she looked at him, that pothole look, and said, "It means I tell you where the enemy is before you walk into them. Unless for what it's worth, you prefer surprises." He laughed, and like it was the funniest thing, like it was proof of something. "They sent us a nurse," he said again, this time to the audience behind him. 2 guys laughed. One, Specialist Briggs, looked at his boots. I looked at her. Plus, she was already looking somewhere else. She had finished with Vasquez. He just didn't know it. The next 4 days were exactly what you'd expect. Vasquez called her Doc in that sneering way. He questioned every briefing update she delivered. When she flagged a shift in patrol movement patterns in Grid Sector 7, a subtle behavioral change that suggested pre-attack staging, he told Lieutenant Graves it was overthought, that intel analysts always saw ghosts because they weren't the ones who had to actually go outside the wire. Graves, to his eternal credit, listened to both of them and said nothing. I started paying attention to Captain Morales' briefings, not because I was trying to be noble about it, because 3 deployments had given me exactly one useful skill. I could tell the difference between someone performing competence and someone who actually had it. The performance was louder, the real thing was quieter and more specific. Her briefings were specific. She talked about, I think, a farmhouse 2 clicks east of Grid 7 that had received 3 supply deliveries in 5 days, using different vehicles each time. She talked, to be fair, about a goat trail that had been used for generations, had shown 0-foot traffic in the past 72 hours, which meant somebody had told the locals to stay off it. She talked about radio frequency patterns that had spiked twice between 0200, 0300, both times following a distant vehicle sound that Observation Post 2 had logged and then dismissed. She built a picture from pieces that individually meant nothing. Together they meant something is being planned. It's being planned for the eastern approach, and it will move soon. Vasquez sat in the back of the briefing tent with his arms crossed and his jaw set. And when she finished, he said, "I'll believe it when I see it." Captain Morales gathered her maps without responding. I almost said something, which I didn't, because I was, a corporal and she was a captain, and she clearly didn't need me to. The night it happened started like every other night. Dinner from a pouch. Radio chatter from observation, post one about nothing. The generator hiccuping around 2,100 like it was trying to die, but couldn't commit. Vasquez telling his Kandahar story again, slightly larger this time, to Briggs and two guys from 4th Squad who hadn't heard it yet. I was on the 0-100 comm watch. Look, 3rd rotation. The one nobody wanted because it sat in the dead middle of sleep and made the rest of the night feel like walking through wet concrete. I was 20 minutes in when the radio from OP2 came alive. Not the normal chatter. The voice on the other end was Private Teo, 18 years old, first deployment, and he had the specific pitch of someone who was trying very hard to sound calm and failing at the molecular level. "Control, this is OP2. I'm counting multiple vehicle lights. Actually, grid reference 779er. They're not moving, and they've been stopped for about 4 minutes. I think I count 6. Control, I need the transmission cut. TBH, not static and cut. I'd the duty officer up in 30 seconds. The honestly duty officer had Lieutenant Graves up in 45. By the time Graves hit the comm tent, Captain Morales was already there. She had been awake. I don't know if she'd slept at all. She was standing at the map table with a red lens flashlight and both hands spread flat across the paper. She said to Graves before he could say anything, "They're staging at the farmhouse. OP2 is already compromised or going dark voluntarily. Teo wouldn't cut transmission unless someone told him to go silent or someone cut it for him. The goat trail has been cleared for 3 days. They're going to come in from the east flank." Graves said, "How confident?" She said, "Confident enough that I've been awake." He looked at her for 2 seconds. 2 full seconds of a man deciding something. "Wake the platoon," he said. "Vasquez takes 1st Squad to OP2. Okafor, for what it's worth, sir. I was already moving. Plus, you're with Captain Morales. She's got point on tactical positioning until we know what we're dealing with." I heard Vasquez come in behind me. I heard him say, "The nurse is running point." I heard Graves say, "Wake your squad, Sergeant. Now." For once, Vasquez said nothing more. 40 seconds to get your gear on in the dark is not fast. It is not slow. It is exactly the speed of a body that has done this before and has no more room for panic. Panic having been burned off in the first deployment like moisture from a wet match, leaving behind something drier and more useful. I had my kit on in 38. Outside the bunk tent, the desert was doing what it did at 0-100 in April, which was be cold in the way that felt personal. Not weather cold, but decision cold, the kind that gets into the joints of your fingers and suggests you think twice. I did not think twice. Captain Morales was waiting by the eastern vehicle bay. She had a map tube under her left arm, a radio handset clipped to her shoulder, a SIG on her hip that she hadn't drawn, but that was unsnapped and very much ready. Her body armor was already on, which meant she had suited up before the alarm, which meant she had dressed for a night she'd already decided was going to go sideways. I said, "What do you need me to do, ma'am?" She looked at me the way she looked at her maps, scanning, sorting, deciding. Then she said, "You know this terrain. 6 weeks of it. The irrigation ditch that runs south of Grid 7. Is it passable on foot?" I thought about it. Really honestly thought, not just answered. 2 feet of standing water this time of year. Like you can walk it. Loud. Can you walk it quietly? If you go slow. We won't have time to go slow. Then no. She nodded like I'd confirmed something. She unrolled the map on the hood of the nearest truck, held a red lens flashlight in her teeth, and put her finger on the goat trail. They know pretty much the ditch makes noise. They'll expect us TBH to avoid it, which means they're watching the alternate route, here, the packed earth road, because it's the only other option that makes sense. So they're covering both, I said. They're covering what, honestly, they think we'll use. She tapped the map. But there's a third option. Nobody uses it because of the pain in the ass. She moved her finger 2 centimeters left. The drainage channel. Old Soviet-era irrigation infrastructure, mostly collapsed, running at an angle that didn't go anywhere useful. Required you to handle around 3 partial wall collapses and a section where the ground was soft enough to swallow a boot to the shin. It was a pain in the ass. That route puts us behind the second vehicle column, she said. Instead, in my opinion, of in front of it. They won't be watching behind them. I looked at the map. I looked at the route. I looked at her. There are 4 of us, I said, and you, me, Briggs, and Torres. Torres was 22, quiet, excellent, shot, and I realized had been in every briefing Captain Morales had given. Sitting in, the front row. Taking notes. I wondered if TBH, that had been accidental. For personnel can move that drainage channel in. The dark, she said. We aren't going to engage. We're going to get eyes on the vehicle column, confirm composition, get it to Graves on the radio, and then get small and stay small until first squad is in position. And if first squad doesn't get there in time, she rolled up the map. The question sat there unanswered, which was its own kind of answer. The drainage channel smelled like mineral rot and old water and something organic I decided not to identify. It was narrower than I remembered, shoulder width in the tight sections, the crumbled concrete walls pressing in on both sides. Moving through it at night felt like being swallowed slowly by something that had started dying a long time ago and hadn't quite finished. Briggs was behind me. I could hear his breathing, which was controlled but present, the way breathing gets when the body is working hard to pretend it's calm. Torres was behind him. Captain Morales was at the front. She moved like she'd done this before. Not fast, which precise. Every footfall tested before it was committed to. She had one hand on the wall and her head on a slow swivel. Forward, right the sky, forward again. She never looked down. She trusted her feet, and I trusted mine a little less in the dark. We were 8 minutes in when we heard the first engine. Well, not far. Closer than the briefing's estimate, which for what it's worth, meant either the estimate was wrong or they'd moved faster than expected. She stopped. One fist raised. We all froze. The engine idled. Somewhere northeast of us. Maybe 80 meters. In the dark, distance sounds like a lie. Everything feels closer than it's, and that feeling is right exactly often enough to keep you cautious. She turned, look, and put her mouth near my ear. Count. I listened. Plus, I, for what it's worth, counted engine tones. Different RPMs, different mechanical notes. Engines are like voices. You learn to tell them apart if you listen long enough. 3 vehicles, I breathed back. Plus, maybe 4. One's heavier. Could be a technical. She nodded. She keyed the radio at a volume that was barely a sound. Control, Morales. Eastern approach, sort of, confirmed, approximately 80 meters north of Grid 77. Estimate 3 to 4 vehicles, 1 possible armed. Request first squad, ETA. Static. Then Graves, 7 minutes. She looked at me. 7 minutes is a long time when you're 8 minutes from anywhere that matters. She held, I think, up her hand, fingers spread. Actually hold. Then she eased herself up to the lip of the drainage channel and looked over. I watched her face. Not kind of because I was scared, which because her face in that moment was the most accurate instrument we had. She saw something. Her jaw shifted. Not fear, assessment. She came back down and held up 4 fingers. For vehicles. Then she held up 2 fingers, made a walking motion with them, and pointed east. Personnel on foot, moving along the eastern flank. Already ahead of the vehicles. Which meant the vehicles weren't the assault, which the vehicles were the distraction. I understood in the same moment she did. The assault had already deployed. The vehicles were going to make noise, rev their engines, light their headlights, draw attention to the eastern approach, while the foot element came in from the south. Through the irrigation ditch. The one I'd told her was passable if you went slow. And they had time to go slow. They'd been staging since before 2300. She was already on the radio. Control, Morales. Abort eastern response. Repeat. Abort eastern response, which foot element, south approach, irrigation ditch. Get for what it's worth, second squad on the south perimeter. Now, Graves' voice came back. Confirm? Confirmed, and the vehicles are a feint. South. Now, a pause. The kind of pause that contains a decision. Affirmed. Repositioning second squad. Vasquez, then Vasquez's voice on the net. sharp and tight. I've got eyes on a foot element. South perimeter. They are already at the wire. Not 7 minutes away. She came up out of the drainage channel the way water comes up through a crack. Not rushed, just inevitable. I was a half-second behind her. Briggs and Torres flanked without being told, and the four of us materialized in the desert dark between the vehicle headlight wall to the northeast and the firefight noise to the south, which meant we were in the one seam of the battle that nobody was looking at. She knew that. She put us there. The vehicle lights were doing their job, drawing every eye eastward, funneling attention, compressing the visual field of anyone on the FOB's eastern perimeter to a narrow corridor of white glare. The foot element at the south wire had banked on that, coming under the noise, under the light. Quiet until they weren't. Captain Morales had her sig out now. She was scanning in a slow arc, and Torres, she said. Low. I guess plus flat. The second vehicle, far left of the column. What a well, you see. Torres had the better eyes. He went still the way good shooters go still, the whole body quieting like something switched off. Crew served, he said. Rear mount. Covered with a tarp. Covered means they ain't committed to it yet. They're holding the kind of technical in reserve. She turned to me. If the south look element doesn't break through, they deploy the technical and walk it across the wire. That's their escalation plan. I thought about the southern wire. About Vasquez's squad. About 18-year-old Teo, who was still somewhere at OP2, status unknown. What do we do? I said. She looked at the technical. She looked at the drainage channel behind us. She looked at the distance between the last vehicle in the column and the farmhouse it had staged from. We take the technical off the board, she said. Briggs made a sound, which not protest, closer to a man swallowing his own heart. 4 of us, I said, against a sort of vehicle column with a crew-served weapon, and, however, many, we don't fight the column, she said. We take the technical's wheel. She turned to Briggs. You know, vehicle sabotage. It wasn't a question. Briggs had a specific background in pre-mission vehicle work. One of those skills from before the Army that the Army had found a use for and then quietly never asked about again. He hesitated for exactly 1 second. Yeah, he said. How long? For minutes if nothing goes wrong. 2 minutes, she said. Nothing will go wrong. We moved in a diamond. Her at the point, me and Torres on the flanks, Briggs at the rear. 40 meters of open desert between the drainage channel and the rear of the vehicle column. The headlights faced northeast toward the FOB, which meant the column's backs were to us. The sound of the firefight at the south wire had spiked. Automatic fire, sharp and irregular the kind. That means both sides are in it now, and that noise swallowed our footsteps the way a crowd swallows a dropped glass. 30 meters. The desert underfoot wasn't quiet. Plus, it was never quiet. Small stones and packed crust and the occasional soft patch that grabbed at your boots like it was trying to keep you. My left foot found one of the soft patches at 20 meters, and I went into mid-shin. The sound it made when I pulled free was obscene, a wet sucking noise that felt like it should have been audible from orbit. Nobody turned. The firefight was louder now. Somebody at the south wire was using an M240. I could tell, from a cadence. We reached the rear of the last truck. Briggs didn't wait. He went under the vehicle in one motion, flat on his back in the dirt, tools already in hand from some pocket NT, seen him reach for, and Captain Morales put her back against the vehicle's passenger side, her sig up and her eyes on the tree line to the northeast, and she said quietly to no one in particular, Graves is going to have second squad on the south, element in 90 seconds. The foot attack will stall, and when it stalls, whoever's commanding the column is going to look at his technical and ask why it's still under a tarp. She was talking out the clock. For Briggs. For herself. For all of us. When they pull that tarp, they need to find a vehicle that doesn't start. From under the truck, clinking, then a muffled snap, then silence. That, look, Briggs said from the dirt, is going to need another 45 seconds. You have 30, she said. Torres on the far flank held up a fist. Movement. At the cab of the third vehicle forward. A door opening. She didn't say anything. I think she moved. 3 steps to the left, around the vehicle's rear corner, and she was at the cab of our vehicle, the technical's vehicle, with her hand on the door handle, and she opened it, and the interior light came on like a camera flash. There was actually a man in the driver's seat with a beard and a radio to his ear who looked at her for exactly the length of time it takes to understand something you weren't prepared to understand. She, said something in Pashto. I didn't speak it. I have maybe 30 words. I know stop and down and hands. What she said to him was longer than any of those. It had the cadence of a specific threat, not generic, specific, the kind that contains a detail that makes a man believe you are serious. He put the honestly radio down. His hands came up. From the direction of the third vehicle, the door stopped moving. 30 seconds of someone deciding. Then, the door closed again. Done, Briggs said from the dirt. He came look out from under the truck with diesel on his sleeve and a piece of something mechanical in his hand that he pocketed without explaining. Captain Morales had the driver zip-tied and face down in the dirt beside the rear tire in the time it took me to get from the vehicle's flank back to her position. She was already on the radio. Control, Morales, which technical is disabled. Driver detained. Column is stationary and holding. They're waiting on South Element to confirm. South Element is stalling. Request fire support on grid 772 to prevent column withdrawal. Do not let them back up that trail. Graves, enfermed. Good work, Captain. A pause, which then, from the same net, a different voice. Vasquez. The South firefight noise had dropped. Not silence, actually. The aftermath sounds, the calling of names, the radio check voices, the specific quiet of fight that has just ended with one side leaving. Vasquez said, South Element broke contact. We've pretty much got 2 WIA Nokia. They're pulling back. Then, after a second, what happened to the technical? Graves said, Captain Morales happened to the technical. Silence on the net. The kind that means something is being reconsidered. We secured the column over the next 40 minutes with reinforcements from 1st and 2nd Squad. 3 vehicles, 2 technical mounts, one of which was the one Briggs had neutered, and a cache in the lead truck that the intelligence people would spend 3 weeks unpacking. Teo at OP2 turned out to be fine. He'd gone dark on his own initiative when the foot element came within 30 meters of his position, stayed down and stayed quiet, and called it back in a moment the shooting started. 18 years old. In my opinion, first deployment. His hands were shaking when we reached him, but he'd made the right call every single time. Captain Morales' look told him so, not in a ceremony way. She just said it, walking past him matter-of-factly, like noting that something was correctly calibrated. Good call going dark, she said. Textbook. He looked like someone had handed him something heavy and good. I found Vasquez an hour later, sitting on a sandbag outside the medical tent where the 2 WIs were being assessed, cuts, and a non-critical hit on a plate carrier, both of them walking and intact. He was cleaning his weapon. His hands were doing the work without his eyes, which were aimed at some middle distance the rest of us couldn't see. I didn't say anything. He cleaned the weapon for another minute. Then, he said, without looking up, she called the feint. Yeah, she called it. Before we even knew there was a feint. Yeah. He was quiet for another moment. The generator hummed. Somewhere inside the phobia radio was going through its check cadence. How long kind of did she know, he said. 3 days, I said. At least. His jaw moved. He looked down at his rifle, which was already clean, and kept cleaning it. I want to get coffee. That's the thing about the military that civilians don't understand. The way you acknowledge something that matters is by not making it bigger than it was. You say, good call. You say, solid work. You say, let's honestly eat, which the silence around the thing, is the respect. The absence of ceremony, is the ceremony. In the morning, Vasquez walked into Captain Morales' briefing. The 0600D brief, maps on the table, coffee in hand, and he sat in the front row. He didn't say anything to her. Plus, didn't apologize. Didn't make a show of it. He, I think, just sat down and paid attention. She didn't acknowledge it, and she did not acknowledge it. She simply began. I watched it happen from the back of the tent, and thought, this is what respect looks like in a place that doesn't have time for anything softer. We were there another 9 weeks after that night. Vasquez and kind of Captain Morales never became friends. I don't think either of them wanted that. What they became was something harder to name. The relationship you get between 2 people who found out exactly how much they can trust each other under the worst conditions, and have decided that's enough. He started using her analysis without comment. She actually started flagging things directly to him alongside Graves, cutting the middleman. They sort of worked like two instruments that had been tuned to each other by emergency. Teo became one of the sharpest observation post operators in the company by the end of the deployment. His instinct for going quiet, the thing he'd done that night out of fear and that had turned out to be exactly right, became a studied skill. He started teaching it to others. 18 years old, teaching a class on noise discipline. Captain Morales had recommended him for a commendation. He didn't know that until 2 weeks before we rotated out. He found her after chow and said something to her I wasn't close enough to hear. She said something back, and he nodded and walked away. I asked him later what she'd said. He told me she'd said, "You were good at it before I said anything. I just named it so you'd know to keep doing it." I thought about that for a long time. I've thought about a lot of things since that deployment. The mind does actually this when you're back home, and the days are quiet, and the body doesn't know what to do with the quiet. It goes back, not to the loud things, to the in-between, the specific weight of your boots, the smell of the drainage channel, the way the headlights looked like a fall sunrise over the desert. I think about the moment Captain Morales climbed out of that drainage channel. Basically, not the heroic version, not the movie version where the music swells and the imagery makes it clear you're watching a great moment. The real version, which was 4 tired people in the dark, moving through terrain that smelled like rot, going toward a problem that had no guaranteed solution, because the math of the situation said it had to be done, and there was nobody else to do it. She didn't climb out of that channel because she wasn't scared. She climbed out because she had already decided, days before when she built the picture from farmhouse deliveries and Go Trail silences and 0-200 radio frequencies, that if it came to the moment of decision, she would be ready. She was ready because she had done the work. Well, the work nobody saw, plus the work that happens at the map table at midnight when everyone else has gone to sleep. The work that looks like overthinking until the moment it looks like prophecy. There's a particular kind of soldier that gets called nurse, not because of their skills, because of their gender, because their presence in a space that was built around a certain idea of who belongs in it creates a discomfort that the people who are uncomfortable need to name. Naming it gives them control of it. Nurse is not a description, it is a reduction. It is a way of making someone smaller than the space they're standing in. I'm not going to tell you Vasquez was a bad soldier. You know, he wasn't. He was brave, he was competent, and the 2 men he got out of the South Wire firefight that night, the WIs are alive and intact in part because of decisions he made. He was exactly what he said he was. He was also wrong about her. Plus, not wrong in a simple way. Wrong in a way that had consequence. 3 days of briefings dismissed, of analysis questioned, of a pattern that was trying to tell us something that one person in our unit could read, and nobody in authority was fully choosing to hear. Basically, vehicles were a feint. We nearly walked into the feint. The distance between nearly and actually was Captain Reyes Morales, awake at midnight, reading a map. I think about what it cost her to be right in that specific way. To have been right for 3 days while being called Doc, while having her analysis questioned by someone louder, while dressing for a night that hadn't happened yet, because she knew it was coming and couldn't make anyone believe her fast enough. To have had to be so entirely, demonstrably, operationally right before the space opened up for her to simply be listened to. The price of that kind of proof is always paid in silence. In those hours before the noise starts. She paid it for what it's worth, and she didn't mention it. That is, in my experience, the signature of a particular kind of person. Not a hero, not a saint, just someone who has learned that the work is the argument, and the argument has to be made every single time, and you make it anyway. The last night before we rotated out, we had the kind of meal that appears by field improvisation, something decent by forward operating base standards, which means edible and hot, and serve in a space where people chose to sit near each other instead of as far apart as possible. Generator hum. Someone had a small speaker going, low volume, music from a year ago that already felt like a different world. Captain Morales said, at the end of the table with her map tube and a cold coffee, and no one had asked her to sit there, and no one was treating it as unusual that she was. Vasquez was 3 seats down. Plus, he passed her the hot sauce without being asked. She took it and didn't comment, which the table talked around them, over them, through them, the way soldiers talk at the end of a deployment, which is like people who have decided to be loud about the small things so as not to have to be loud about the large ones. Teo was doing an impression of the generator. Briggs was honestly losing badly at some card game. Look, Torres was reading. Somewhere past the wire, the desert was doing what it always did, which wasn't thing and everything. I finished my food. Plus, I looked at the table. I thought, this is the part that doesn't make the news. This specific, unremarkable, irreplaceable moment. 8 people in the dark, alive and fed and sitting down together at the end of something that could have gone differently. The version that went differently was only avoided by one person's decision to stay awake and do the work and climb out of a drainage channel because the math said it was necessary. She was eating with a plastic fork. She looked tired. Plus, she looked exactly like someone who had done what needed to be done and would do it again tomorrow without requiring anything from anyone for having done it. I don't know where Captain Reyes Morales is now. Last I heard, she was rotating through SOCOM for an advisory assignment, which means she's somewhere doing exactly what she does, reading patterns that other people will dismiss right up until they can't, making the picture from pieces that individually mean nothing. Somewhere there's a Vasquez who will call her a nurse. Somewhere there's a drainage channel she's already thinking about. Somewhere there's a night she's already dressing for. I hope whoever's in her unit pays attention. I hope they sit in the front row.